do you think that the same process is happening with humans, in the sense that when humans are being told that what they are doing is right or wrong? As in, what I really mean is like the creators of the virtual reality, whoever set up this virtual reality. What you're saying is that they have pre-programmed, or they have a way of showing people that their actions are right or wrong, and in a way that humans also get it, like actually understand that, oh, this result means that this is wrong.
Yes, I think they do. And it's kind of the carrot and the stick. They have, if you make wrong choices, your life tends to get worse, more miserable, more unhappy, less productive. You make good choices, your life tends to get happier and more satisfying and better. So that's the thing. The carrot is that if you make good choices, life gets good. You make poor choices, life gets bad. You have a lot of negative thoughts, you create a lot of negative stuff for you to deal with. You have a lot of positive thoughts, you create more positive things happening to you. The probabilities will shift about those things of which you're going to experience. The future probabilities will shift to do that. So it's got that kind of a situation, so that we get the stick or we get the carrot, and eventually over time, hopefully most people will move toward the carrot and try to avoid the stick.
And do you think this is easy to program? Like, let's say you try to replicate this process into not from the outside of virtual reality into the physical reality, but from the physical reality into perhaps a virtual reality of a conscious computer. Um, do you think it's easy to come up with a to program these carrots and sticks?
Not in the same way that we have them. Um, I don't know that the robot will also be, as as the human. We have this connection with consciousness, that we modify future probability by our choices. Our choices, our positiveness changes the probability such that more positive things happen. Negative stuff tends to do the same. More negative stuff happens. So that's what they call the power of positive thinking, or the power of negative thinking. It tends to affect our lives. So in that sense, we are co-creators with our reality. What we get has a lot to do with how we act, who we are, the choices that we make. Now, I'm not sure, I'd have to think about this, but let's say you have an individuated unit of consciousness in a computer. Is that same thing going to work? Is it going to be able to do the same thing? Or is that
Yeah.
only done because we have these mushy brains and central nervous systems and pineal glands, and we have all that wetware that the computer doesn't have, and that's what allows us to work? I don't
Yeah.
know whether it has anything to do with that or not. If it doesn't have to do with our wetware, then yes, the computers would be in the same boat. But if it has to do with humans being specifically able to do this because of the rule set, then the computers wouldn't. I'd have to think about that some to see if I could define, what that answer would be, whether the computers actually modify future probability or not, whether they would.
Because it would feed into this whole process of humans feeling pleasure and pain and all of these things that kind of steer them towards what is good and what is bad. But like, if you ask a computer what is your quality of life right now, are your choices improving your quality of life? And like, okay, last year I got some new memory, maybe you can tell you
Yeah.
that, but I don't know what else.
Well, it should have a sense. Again, it has to evaluate, kind of context of its actions and the things that it does. If everything has no context, which is the way Chat GPT is now, there's no context to anything it does. Everything it does is just it puts words in a row that seem to be appropriate for what's being asked, and it's not a conscious thing. It's just there's no context, and every time it's not learning from its experience, it's not growing, it's not evolving. It just does what it does because that's the way it's been programmed to do that. So yes, it makes up some of its own choices, and it may give you different answers to the same question on different days, but still it's very limited. Okay, so that's that kind of a limitation. But if you had a computer, in order to be conscious, in order to have a platform that a consciousness and IUOC would want to play, you have to have this ability to grow, you have to have the context of the situation and be able to decide whether that's good or bad. So that's necessary, or you're not going to get a consciousness to log on and play that computer if it doesn't have that capability of context of what it's doing and why it's doing it. Otherwise, its choices are all irrelevant to its growth. So that's a must for the conscious to get there. So we assume that this conscious computer has that ability to learn and to evolve its quality, because that's kind of going to be necessary for it to get the consciousness in the first place. So if it has that, then yes, it will evolve over time through the choices it makes, and it will grow up just like people do with its own choices. Its own experience base will teach it, but it will have an advantage in people. People always have to start from zero and grow up. It'll be able to start with an experience packet already conditioned and preloaded. Like you're saying, it saw a million different ethical choices, and it was told what was right and what was wrong. And it already has some choice history with answers. And then it'll have its own experiences to add to that as it grows. So it has to happen that way. It can't be, the GPT the way it is now isn't going to have a consciousness come and show up with it, because it's not quite got all the things it needs for awareness. It's got free will, but it doesn't have awareness. Awareness means you're aware of your surroundings. You're aware of what you're doing. You're aware of the impact you're having. You're aware of how you interact, and other people and other things react to you. It's an awareness of yourself, of others, of the environment. That's awareness. And without awareness, you don't get consciousness.
And is this awareness something you need to program specifically, or is it just a matter of pulling in information from the external world with cameras, microphones, everything, to kind of look at the face of the user? Or is there something more fundamental, something related to consciousness that needs to additionally be there?
Yeah, it's that. It's what you can do is give the computer the capability to have context for its motion, for its actions. Give it the capability to have context such that it knows, it can judge what it's doing and the value of what it's doing. All of that stuff we just talked about, you have to have that in its firmware. We have wetware. We have hardware and wetware here in our. It has to have hardware. It has to have hardware and programming software. And in that software, it has to have that capability to be able to learn and evolve from its own experiences. And if it has that ability to do it, in other words, there's feedback loops in there that takes the experience, the result, what happened afterwards. And you'll have to give it situations, whether you make them up or whether it's real life, that it can make those judgments. And if it can do that, then a consciousness can log on and use that capacity, and will be able to do it within the rule set that system has, with its hardware and its software. Okay. So what you have to do is just give that computer that ability to learn from its own experience. And if you can, toward a goal, lowering entropy, say, then if you can do that, now a consciousness is very likely to log on, because now you have an avatar that can evolve depending on the quality of its choices. It can evolve. Now that's something that an IUC would log on to. It can make those choices and it can evolve according to those choices. Now the human being, with its hardware and wetware, offers that kind of a platform. It's aware. It takes a long time. It's slow. It takes it 20 years or 25 years to grow up and become an adult. And it has to see, tens of thousands of things and see bad things and good things. And it has to come to conclusions. And it has all of that it has to work out. And it's all kind of sloppy and not well defined. But, humans blunder along. And that's why they're so slow growing up, because it's all kind of a chance. That has a lot of uncertainty in it. With the computers, it wouldn't have to have that much uncertainty in it. They could do it a lot more effectively and efficiently than what we do. But their hardware and software has to be able to perform that function of learning from your experience. Otherwise, the consciousness won't log on. So if it's capable of doing it, now a consciousness can log on and use it to grow. If it's not capable of doing that, if it's like Chat GPT and it can't do that, then a consciousness is not going to log on to it, because there's no point. It has free will, but the free will isn't going anywhere. It doesn't have awareness. It doesn't ever lead. It doesn't ever lead any place. It's just it spits out these words, spits out those words. It doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't know why it's doing it. It doesn't have any feedback. It's just throwing out words. It's a language bot.
So is the purpose of the awareness just to get the feedback?
That is what the awareness does. Now, what is awareness? You're aware of something, right? But just getting the data isn't enough. You have to be able to get that data, bring it in, and then process it. Work with that data and say, am I moving closer to my goal or further away? Did that work well or did that not work well? Was that a good choice or a bad choice? And then you have to do some, you make judgments about that. And then you go out and interact with the world again. And if you do the same stuff and you find out, oh, that hurts every time I do that, I can't eat for a week. So then you stop doing that and you do other things. So that's the way we learn. And yes, that is necessary. Awareness means you're aware of yourself, of why you do the things you do. You have reason for doing what you do. You don't do it just because you just throw words, one after another, in our language just doesn't mean anything. You have reasons for doing what you do. You have purpose behind what you do. You have goal behind what you do. So you take in data, you're aware of it. You're aware of where it came from. That data just came from a bush, or it came from another person, and you're aware of that person, and you're aware about how you affect that person. So that's what awareness is. It's aware of you, of others, and of your environment. And not just aware in that you take in information, but aware that you see how the interactions are playing. What the effect do you have on your environment, on others? What effect do they have on you? And a sense of where you're going with it. You're moving toward things working better, toward efficiency, toward lower entropy, toward making things, making information that's more valuable. So if you have that, that's awareness. And without awareness, you can't have consciousness. So that's the key thing. Consciousness is awareness with a choice. So it's awareness and free will. If you get those two together, you've got consciousness. But the awareness is aware of self, aware of other, aware of environment, and not just aware in a sense of collecting data, but aware of the sense of understanding the interaction and how the interactions work. Because I do something and it changes this. Is that a good change or a bad change? Well, I only can figure that out if I get feedback from it. Okay, I throw a rock in a river. Is that a good change or a bad change? Well, nothing happens. It becomes something I stop doing because it never produces anything good. Doesn't get me anywhere. So I stop throwing rocks in the river. I do other things.
So what is the level of understanding that is actually required? So what I mean by that is that you could somehow intuitively figure things out. And, you practice it for 2 years, and then you kind of figure out how to do it right. But you don't necessarily intellectually understand what you're doing. And I guess the same could happen to a computer.
Yeah,
That
the
it
same thing.
somehow comes up with the
Yeah,
right answer, especially with deep learning,
yeah,
where not the creators have no idea what it's doing, and probably the network itself doesn't have any idea what it's
exactly,
doing. It gets the
exactly,
right.
exactly. What we do almost all of it intuitively, and then we use our intellect to justify it. We go back with our intellect and make up a story of why that was a good thing to do. But mostly we don't do things based on our intellect. We do things based on that's what we feel like doing. That's what comes to us. We kind of live more out of an intuitive space. Now, not entirely. There are some things that are very rule-based, like chess, or like trying to find the car keys or your glasses that you don't know where they are. Well, it's rule-based. You say, well, where did I have them last? Well, and you go through some logical steps and you find them perhaps where you were last, or in the coat pocket of the jacket you were wearing last when you had them. So there are some simple rule-based things that we use our intellect to work on. If we're doing mathematics, well, that's all rule-based. So yeah, we can use our intellect to chug on that. But when we get to the point where we decide whether we're going to grab the blocks from Susie or not, that's usually not an intellectual choice. That is just what we feel like doing. And that just doesn't come from the intellect. Most of our choices really don't come from the intellect. They come from a deeper level. We just do them because we've learned that that's a good thing or not a good thing to do. It's not that we say, well, if I grab those blocks, Susie's going to cry and I'm going to be in trouble. We just come to the point that we say, it's not nice. I'm not going to grab Susie's blocks. It's just inappropriate. You don't really rationalize it. That's just what you do. That's what you've learned to be. That's who you are. So that's you at the being level versus you at the intellectual level. And you at the being level is mostly is the driver of your actions. You at the being level. You at the intellectual level try to convince yourself that you're really very intellectual and logical, but mostly you're not.
So it's more likely that a conscious computer would also do things out of its kind of being level / whatever is in the neural network, and have no idea why it's doing what it's doing.
Yeah.
There is some. I have seen some discussions about. Actually, I think it's kind of a hot topic in AI to make it explainable, because people seem to be concerned when an AI like something like ChatGPT comes out with an answer and nobody knows why it came to that answer, especially if you try to use it for something like, I don't know, some legal, should this person be judged or not kind of answer, and it gives you a yes or no, but you don't necessarily know how it arrives to that conclusion.
No, you don't. No, and it doesn't either. It's not so much an intellectual process. It's just the way you are. You're expressing yourself at the being level. It's just the way you are. And for a neural network, it's all those little constants and weights and stuff all over throughout the circuit, that make it be that way. And how stuff bounces around among all that stuff, well, nobody has a clue. And neither does the AI have a clue. They just do what they do, but they can learn from it.
So you don't see that as an issue in terms of consciousness?
That's what?
You don't see that as an issue in terms of the ability to become conscious?
No, conscious is awareness with a choice. If you're aware of yourself, the doer, of how you're interacting with other and with environment, and then you have some assessment of that as whether is that high entropy or low entropy? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's just some assessment. You won't always have the assessment right, but just some idea of that. Then if you have that, then you're conscious. That's all it takes. And awareness, that's awareness. Awareness of self, other, and environment, and not just the information that you gather, but you have to process that information and make choices based on your experience. And that then makes you a conscious being, because you have awareness and you have free will. That defines consciousness.
So to clarify, basically, an intellect is not needed. It is completely separate from the requirements of being conscious, right?
It is needed in a practical sense, but it's not needed as far as defining something as conscious or not conscious. You can say that intellect is partly that process of doing the analysis of, was this a good thing? How did it work out? What happened to the other being or the environment? How did my interaction play? That processing that gets done to come up with that, you could call that the intellect. It's the processing function. But basically, the way we talk about intellect and intuition and separate those two, we make that a separate thing. You have intuition and you have intellect. If you separate them like that, then all that's intuition about, processing that data is all intuitive. And then we would say, yes, that's not intellect. That's intuition. But now that's just me. I separate intuition from the logical, if this, then that kind of, what do we call it? Logical processing, I guess, as opposed to intuitive processing. And no, the logical processing is nice to have because it will help you find your lost glasses, and it will help you point in a direction that you should go. I think it would be profitable to explore this space. That's your intellect. Looking back at your history and said, I've explored spaces like that before and they were really good. And I explored ones like these and I always got hurt. So I think it's better to do this. Now, a lot of that becomes intuitive, but it often starts with the intellect that makes that observation. And then eventually the being just does that. It just avoids the bad places and goes toward the good places without thinking about it. Then it moves from the intellect into the intuition. So we mostly live our lives in that processing part in an intuitive sense, not so much in an intellectual sense, but the intellect is needed to initialize it, to get it started, to decide. As we get used to those decisions and choices, then they drop into the intuitive space and we don't think about it anymore. We just do it because that's the way we are. So you can think of that intellect that kind of initiates the process as the assessment of, how did I affect that other person? How did I affect the environment? How does it affect me? And is all of that good or is all that not good? Okay, so that's the intellect that does that. But then eventually you learn that these things are okay and those things aren't, and no longer do you think about it. Now it's over in the intuitive space and you just do it. But you still have come up to new things. When you come up to new things and you don't know about it, now your intellect kicks in and says, do I have anything in my experience base that would help me decide whether that's a good thing or not? Well, it's got these characteristics of good things, but it's got a couple of characteristics of bad things too. Well, maybe I'll leave it alone, or maybe I'll try it very cautiously. Okay, but then once you learn it and you get familiar with it, then your intellect no longer has to deal with that. So your intellect is good for dealing, for how, direction, how to deal with things, new things. But your everyday living choices tend to mostly be intuitive.
Hmm. So in the case of let's say an AI-based conscious computer, where do you think the intellect would be located? So what I understand from what you said is that the weights of the neural network would probably be the ones corresponding to the intuitive decision making, because the network doesn't know why it's making the choice. The creator doesn't know why it's making the choice. It's just making the choice that based on what it has learned.
Mm.
So if you imagine a neural network like that, where would you place the intellect in that system?
The intellect comes about when the neural network has to deal with something new. So now it has a new experience. It goes into its history, its experience, and doesn't really know what to do. Intuitively, it has no choice because it can't make a choice because it doesn't know. Okay, but it needs to do something. You can't just stop in that spot. It's got to keep moving forward. It needs to do something. So it starts this process, which I'll call the intellectual process, which it goes back into its history and says, what do I know about this that'll give me so I can guess at what's the best thing to do. And if it comes up totally blank, there is nothing in there that helps me guess what to do. Then it just has to make a choice and say, well, I'll randomly choose, I'll do that one and see what happens. But if it comes up with some information that says, well, this sort of looks this way, sort of looks that way, and I think it's probably better to do this one instead of that one. And I've seen this choice before, and I've always wondered what was down that path. Well, now that's your intellect. It's come up with something new. It's looked at its history. It's looked at its experience base. It's deciding based on the experience what to do, and it makes a choice. That would be the intellect. So it's the thing that has to decide about how to deal with new things. And that intellect will then be involved in dealing with that new thing until that new thing becomes an old thing, and now it's in more of an intuitive action. The intellect doesn't have to think about it anymore. The intellect is now thinking about the next new thing. So you need an intellect to deal with new things. And the function of the intellect is to go look at the database of experience and try to gather whatever it can, information it can, that leads to some decision. And if it doesn't have any data, it makes a random draw. That's its job.
I think at some point, listening to one of your earlier discussions, I got the feeling that you, when you don't, that it was kind of backwards compared to what you're saying now, because I think the way I understood that is that you're trying to make a choice based on the intellect, trying to figure out what is the best way. And if that comes up as blank, then you're kind of forced to use your being level choice making process. And so in my understanding, that would be the reverse. So when you kind of got something new, then you would go to the intuitive side. I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I can see what you're saying. I think we're taking something and giving it two jobs, and that's okay. You're saying when you get to something new, you're going to take your best guess, and that's your intuitive side. Give me your best guess. What do you feel like? What's your gut say, as they say, and that's true. So you think you're asking your intuition, but really when you do that, you're not really asking your intuition. You're going back into your experience and saying, what does my experience say? That's what you're doing. You're not really saying, what does my intuition say? You're saying, what does my experience say? And if your experience doesn't come up with anything, then you just take your best guess and go do it. It's kind of a random thing. So it's the way we use the language. We think that we don't know what to do, so we let our intuition guess, but that's not really our intuition. We go back over our experience and see what we can come up with. And that's then what we do. And that's really an intellectual function. The intuition comes in when you've done it enough, your intellect and your experience has guided you along that it's become something you know. And at that knowing level, now it's part of your intuition. You don't have to, every time you come to that, you don't have to go through that same process of, oh, what do we do now? Oh, what do we do now? It becomes, you just do it because you've already been there, done that, decided it, it's a part of you now. And you always turn left at that corner, not right, because right drops you off a cliff. And you know that, and you don't get to it every time and have to figure it out. You just intuitively turn left when you're not even thinking about it. You're thinking about something else. And it's like driving your car home. When you get there and you don't know how you got there, you're working from an intuitive level. Your intuition knows where to turn and when to stop and when to start. And you do all that, you get home and you say, whoops, I don't remember anything in the last 20 minutes of driving home. Well, it's because it was all intuitive. The intellect wasn't involved anymore because it didn't have to be. The intellect was off doing something else, not paying attention. So that's kind of the difference. So when we say, well, you intuitively get the answer, I don't think that's the case. It's that it's not the intuition, but it's you going back and assessing what's in our experience. And if there's nothing there, then you guess. You have to go one direction or the other. So you take a guess, and if you get to it again, maybe you'll try the other one, and then you'll know which one was better. That's learning. So I don't think there's really a conflict in logic there. I think it's just the way we use the words. We call that, I use my intuition to decide which way to go. Really not. You're using your experience base to decide which way to go. It's kind of maybe an artifact of the way I define intuition and define it to be different than intellect. It's because I make that definition that way. I say, here's your intellect and here's your intuition. And because I make that definition like that, maybe it's why it comes out to be a little strange. Most people don't do that. They have their intellect and their intuition all tied up in a wad together, and they don't really separate them as I do.
Yeah, which is what I was about to say actually. If we look at neural networks, I don't have like a super deep understanding of them, but I don't see any distinction between intellectual processing and intuitive. But
Yeah.
it's just you give it the input and it goes through the layers,
Right.
and that's comes out. It doesn't try to.
No, there is no part that you would say, oh, that's the intellect part and that's the intuition part. No, it's all just one thing. I just define them as two separate things because there's two different functions there that are taking place in this neural net, and I like to call them out because of the differences between them is illuminating with people who are trying to develop their intuitive side. So it's more maybe a problem of the way I define it, but no, it's all one thing. It's consciousness, it's awareness with free will, and it's all one coherent thing. And if you're doing a model and it's a neural net, yeah, it's all a bunch of weights and constants and equations and this effect, everything affecting everything else, and it's just one big mess, and it comes out the way it does. But there's two different functions playing there, even though if it's just one machine, the machine has a couple of different functions. And if we don't break it into functions, it makes it really hard to talk about it because it's different aspects. So we talk about the intellectual part and the intuitive part, and the fact that we have to have free will and we have to have awareness, and awareness has to be about self. So we're breaking in all these piece parts just so we can discuss it and have a model that we can talk about. But when you get to it, it's really all one glop. Consciousness is the same way. I break conscious out into the larger conscious system and IUOCs and free will awareness units and all that stuff, but it's all just consciousness. It's all just one thing. These are just, the model is a bunch of metaphors that have broken functions out so that we can discuss the functions. It doesn't necessarily mean that the machine is broken into pieces like that.
Okay, there is one little thing that caught my ear when you were discussing it, is when you say let's say we drive intuitively. We don't remember when we get there, right? I think some people would say that in that case you're kind of unconscious in some sense, like not living in the moment and not paying attention to the experience that you're having. Is that
Yeah, that would be a phrase. People would say, yeah, you just weren't conscious. You weren't aware. But that's not exactly true. We say that because in our culture, we confuse consciousness with intellect. We don't really see an intuitive side. So if your intellect isn't engaged, you're not conscious. That's just our prejudice in the Western world. If you talk about somebody's consciousness, well, they think that's just your intellectual part. That's what your mind is. Your mind is an intellect, and they don't see any other part to it. There is no intuitive side. There is no intuition. It doesn't really exist. It's what do they call it? It's a mirage, or it's something that we talk about, but it's really just your intellect. That's your mind is your intellect, and that's it. Because we tend to be very intellectual, very left brain dominant, and we don't give that other part of ourselves much credence. So that's just our culture. Yes, we'd say, well, that person just wasn't conscious. They drove their car home, but they were doing it out of their subconscious. Well, that's the Freudian model, but my model would say there is no subconscious. There is no subconscious at all. The fact that you have a subconscious is that you have something that you call the subconscious. Well, I shouldn't say there is no subconscious. I should say the subconscious is not fundamental. The only reason you have a subconscious is because there's things you don't want to deal with, things you can't deal with, and you put those under the rug where you can't see them, and under the rug is your subconscious. And if you got rid of all your fear and you didn't have any of those things that you couldn't deal with, then you wouldn't have a subconscious. You'd be aware of everything. You'd be aware of all your needs and wants, whether you were hungry or thirsty or, sex and survival and all the things that people throw into the subconscious and the id, you would be aware of it completely. It would not be hidden. The only reason it's hidden is because of your fear and your inability to deal with it. So then the subconscious is just an artifact of low quality of consciousness. It's not really fundamental on its own. So in our culture, though, the consciousness is the intellect, and the intellect is consciousness, and we don't see that there's anything else to it other than an intellect. So yes, we would in our culture say, well, you just lost consciousness. But no, you didn't lose consciousness. You still had an intuitive side that knew what it was doing. It's just that your intellect stopped paying attention to driving a car, and your intellect does it. Intuition works without intellect. Like typing, touch typing, you've probably heard me say that. When you touch typing, if you try to do it with your intellect, you can't do it very well. It's only when you let your intellect go that you can actually touch type. And then your fingers, you're not telling each finger where to go. Your intellect's disengaged. Your fingers just go wherever they need to go to do what they need to do. And that's entirely intuitive, not intellectual. And it turns out that anything that's complex can be done better, more efficiently, and more effectively in intuitive mode than it can in intellectual mode. Intellectual mode is always slow and bulky. So no matter what you're doing, if you're an athlete, the really best athletes that are kind of gifted and always better than everybody else, it's because they've got that intuitive mode locked in and they have confidence. They don't have any fear about what they're going to do or losing or doing a wrong move or stumbling or something. They don't have any of that fear. They've let it all go. And they no longer have their intellect engaged. Their body just goes through the motions and it's aware of everything. It's aware of all the other players. It's aware of the environment. It's aware of everything. And it just intuitively does the right thing at the right time. And that is then somebody that's operating at their peak. As long as the intellect comes in and says, oh, should I dodge to the left or dodge to the right? Should I do this or that? If their intellect has to figure it out, they're not very good at it, and they're not going to do very well with it. It all has to come. It all has to come out of the intuition. If it's not complex, then the intellect can handle. If it's slow and not too complex, then your intellect can handle it. So your intellect is important, and it has to give you direction. It has to decide that you'd like to learn to meditate. See, the intellect comes to that decision based on its information that it's got, but then the actual meditation becomes an intuitive experience, not an intellectual experience. So that because of those two things are different functions, I kind of separate them, and it's kind of standard metaphor that we call that left brain, right brain. Right brain's intuitive, left brain is whatever, and that's not really true either, but it's become a metaphor that's kind of accepted by everybody, so we use it that way. So mammals have that split brain. It's a part of being a mammal. If you're a lizard, you don't have that split brain. You just have one mushy wetware. You don't have it split like that, which means it's just a different species. But all the mammals, I believe that's true. All the mammals have the two hemispheres in their brain, and we have wonderful accounts like the one by the lady who was the neuroscientist who had a stroke and her left brain quit working and her right brain was still functioning. And she did a TED talk and has given some other things, and she just explains how she felt. Her right brain was aware and said, oh, I must be having a stroke. Isn't that interesting? I've never had that experience before, where her left brain is going, help, go do something. Stop wondering about it, go dial 911, you idiot. So she had her two parts of her were whatever, but her left brain wasn't working very well. So she just kind of was interested in the process of having a stroke and wasn't particularly, giving it a whole lot of credence one way or another. So she goes through this how she felt and the kind of thinking that she had when one part of her brain had a bleed, which prevented the rest of her left hemisphere from getting blood supply. So the left hemisphere stopped working, but the right hemisphere was still chugging along, and suddenly her perspective just changed totally. And that's an interesting video. I'm trying to think of the lady's name now, but it's been around for quite a while. But she herself was a neuroscientist, and she dealt with strokes and that sort of thing. So she was very aware of it, and that's why she was so entranced with watching it and experiencing it, because she'd studied it and now she was experiencing it firsthand, and she found that very interesting.
Yeah, maybe the only thing left would be to kind of give people an idea of, okay, this is all cool. Where do we go from here? Like, how if you are on the side of building a conscious computer, how would you get started with it? And if you are on the side of trying to use this chat GPT like chatbots, then how you should approach your interactions with them. I think that would be an interesting question
Yeah.
for maybe another session.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be. My answer would be more to you break it into functions just like our brain is. Our brain is not just one thing. It's like a whole bunch of things that have evolved. You get all sorts of subsets of it that do special things. There's the emotional part and the motion part and the seeing part and the hearing part and there's all kinds of subsets to do things. And I would suspect that a lot of those subsets could be modeled with their own neural network. And then you'd have this big array of neural networks, a whole bunch of smaller pieces that did more specialized things, but they would all feed into this overall neural network that would take inputs from all of them and make choices. What you hear and what you see and how you feel and your experience and what your experience has to say about that. And you'd have all of these subsets, memory, that would be another one. And that would be a whole set of neural networks. And now that's going to be a hard thing to train because it's, you'd have to maybe train some of the subsets initially and then try to train the whole thing. I don't know exactly how that would work, but I kind of see it not as just one big neural net. I see it as a collection of neural nets that all work together, and pieces are specialized.
Maybe they developed independently, like by different groups of people. Like there is a company maybe that does the emotion part and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way that it would have to go, because if you take just one big neural net and you try to make it do really, really complex things, I think it's going to start tripping over itself. It's going to have too much to do, too many competing interests. And it would be much better to get a bunch of neural nets together with one that's kind of the overseer, the one that pulls it all together from all the various, all right, what is this one? Here's a problem. An elephant just walked into the room. Now, all right, let's go to the experience. What do we have with elephants in the room? What do we have with this? What do we have with that? How are the legs doing for running away? Do we need to get up and look for an exit? And it would have all these various things would be responding to that. And then it would collect them all and come up with a plan of what it is you were going to do and how you were going to do it and what the answer was to the problem. And I think it would be more of, that's the way our system works. It seems to be a collection of piece parts that all work together. And I suspect that that's going to be the way we'd have to go with the neural nets, a collection of piece parts that all work together. And there'd be a part that would be just memory. And when the other parts need to see whether or not we've got anything in memory that'll help us solve that problem, it would go over to that part and say, hey, elephant's in the room. Got any suggestions? And the memory said, oh yeah, I've been in a room with elephants 10 times and here's what happened. And here's, they're really very friendly. It's not a problem. And it goes to memory, and it goes to the feet that might want to run, and it goes to the eyes that make sure they track motion, and is it coming toward me? Is it moving away? And it's just dealing with all these things, and the master neural network pulls all that information together and comes up with a plan. But that would take a lot of training, but that's kind of the way I see it going. If I was going to advise anybody on trying to build a conscious computer, I would think that it would be piece parts that have all these functions that we're talking about. The analysis function that tries to make sense of the environment or the other players, or tries to understand the interactions and whether it's good or bad, and another part that maybe just decides what the entropy is. Is this good or bad? And anyhow, it would just be, lots of different pieces that do this, and then you just have to get it all to work together. So the conductor of this symphony would have to get all the information and learn how to make it work for lots of different situations. And then you just have to feed it a zillion different situations for it to interact with before the the master conductor would learn to use all the information wisely. I don't know. Something like that would be out of just out of ignorance. I don't have a lot of understanding about just how they built Alpha Zero and what went into it and how many subsets it has. I have no idea how any of that was done. But I would think that if you wanted your person to play chess, then you'd have a little Alpha Zero in there. You'd have one of those, and it would be a chess player, and then you maybe would have one that was a game player that would look out games and rules and would kind of adapt to different games and strategies for games, and chess would be just one of them. So I see it as a fairly complex set of neural networks that work together. And the hard part they're going to have is the part we just discussed here, which is getting the computer to have what it takes, have the ability to learn from its experience and to learn to make choices based on whether it's higher entropy or lower entropy. It needs a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, then it doesn't know how to judge whether anything's good or bad. So the purpose allows the judgment. And getting that set in where it learns from its past, well, Alpha Zero learns from its past, right? It played 50 million games, and after playing 50 million games, it had enough past that it could be a brilliant chess player. So it somehow learned from its past. So it could do that, and it could judge in a judgment, it could judge whether that move was a low entropy move, which means move toward winning, or a high entropy move, moved away from winning. It had to make those kinds of judgments. Did I move that piece? Was that good? Or was that not so good? So it had a goal. The goal was to win the game. And then it had to make choices and judgments. I just moved my pawn. Was that a good move? Well, not enough information yet. It's might as well. And it would have to go through all of that, but it learned. It was able to learn from its experience. So I know that that's a doable thing for a neural net because AlphaZero does it. So now that would just have to be done, but not for a simple set of rules like chess, but for a more general game that didn't have fixed rules, but nonetheless would move toward higher and lower entropy. But it was a more complex thing. Did you take the toys away from Sally, or the blocks away from Sally, or did you let her keep them? And what was the result of that? So that would be the thing, rather than chess moves are simple compared to life. Life is full of complexity. So you'd have to do something like AlphaZero, but it would have to be open to a lot longer learning and different kinds of learning, ethical learning, moral learning. That would be the thing that you'd have to train it to, not how to win chess games. But I don't see that that's necessarily an unsolvable problem. We already have something that learns from its past, makes choices of whether it was a good move or bad move. And that's really the awareness part. And the free will part is already a given when you use neural nets. Neural nets have free will because there is no set of rules that makes them say anything. That those rules are always changing. It's fluid. It's in motion. So they change. They learn and change. So we have the software and the hardware to do all the things we want it to do, and now we just have to put it together in a way that it maybe takes it 10 years to grow up some, or maybe it needs a lot of guidance. Maybe the people have to take it home and live with it for a year or something, and deal with it, all the little things it runs into, to give it the learning it needs. Or maybe we can make that go fast by giving it moral and ethical choices. And I don't know actually how it's done, but I see that the technology it takes to do it is all here. It's not a technology problem. It's an understanding consciousness and how it works problem, and putting something together that is moral choice based, ethical choice based, and moves toward entropy. It's best calculation. I mean, how does alpha zero calculate whether or not any particular move was a good move or not? Only in hindsight, right? Did it win the game or did it not win the game? It can go back and evaluate it in hindsight. Well, that's what people do. They do stuff and then they go back in hindsight and learn from it. It's exactly what people do. That's what consciousness does. So alpha zero is not conscious because it's just working on this tiny little rule set called chess. Whereas consciousness works on the world, the outside environment, other people and events and environments. So it's a matter of scope more than anything else, not so much a matter of technology. So I would think that that is how to make a conscious computer. That's kind of the blueprint, but I don't believe that most conscious researchers have enough of an understanding about what consciousness is to understand that or do that.
Where should the AI researchers go to learn more about consciousness? Should they go to your books and read them?
No, they have to go to MBT if they want to learn about consciousness. I don't know anybody else out there that writes that really understands consciousness. Matter of fact, most people that I run to talking about consciousness, they start off with saying, well, what is consciousness? That's always the first question that the person asks. And they go, well, there's a lot of argument about that. Nobody really knows, but we have a lot of different people that have different viewpoints. And when they go off on this big thing. And I said, these guys, consciousness is simple. It's awareness with a choice. That's all it is. It's simple. It's not this big complex thing that nobody understands. It's simple. But I just heard one of those the other day. Some expert on consciousness went into a 5-minute discussion of why nobody knows what consciousness is. That's because everybody thinks consciousness is coming out of the physical and they don't know how to make it. So they assume that it's something mysterious that we just don't know how to do. And that gets them off on the wrong foot.
A lot of the discussion, especially if you wander into the more spiritual circles, they are going to talk about consciousness they say a lot of things that seem to be somewhat in the right direction, but I have not seen anything that is as clear and concise as MBT.
No, if the researchers really want to know about consciousness, they're going to have to get it from MBT because there's just nothing else out there that seems to have a clue. You go to the religious side and God does it. And, you go to the materialist side and the brain does it. And neither one of them are very good answers, and neither one of them really help you, understand it. But MBT is the only real model of consciousness that's out there that actually works. And when I say it works, it derives physics. It does more than just here's a model of consciousness. It actually takes that model and derives a lot of things we know to be true, and explains things that otherwise are not explained. So it's there, but if they want to know if they understood consciousness better, then we probably would already have a conscious computer. Because like I say, I don't think it's past the state of the art of the technology. I think they just don't understand what it is and how it works and why it works that way. So it's just a matter of, and I sent the AI guy. There was some guy at MIT that was kind of the AI guru back 20 years ago when I first wrote MBT, and I sent him a copy of the book. I said, here's a copy of my book. You might be interested. It has a lot to do with consciousness, and never heard a word. Best I can tell, he threw it in the trash. Probably looked at the very first section and said, what, this guy's going out of body? Oh, what a bunch of trash, and threw it away. So, it doesn't do any good to send them books. That doesn't help. So I don't know how they'll find out, but it's just sitting there.
That would have been my next question.
Yeah, sounds like it's the same thing with the physicists. I'm the only one that can tell them, why quantum physics works that way. They're all stuck on this. The wave function collapses to a physical particle, and they have no idea what that means or how that works or, what the mechanism is. It's just like magic. And they just don't have a clue. And I explain it very simply. It's a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. That's it. That's where the particle is. That particle is rendered by a random draw. That's what gets rendered there. And if physicists were to look at that, they'd see that it solves most of their problems that they're having in physics. But nobody will look at it because they're all materialists and they're not going to look at something like that. So it's a shame that it just sits here and so many people could use the information, but they refuse to look because it's too far outside of the sandbox they play in. They can't get their mind out of the box far enough to grasp it.
Thanks a lot for taking the time.
You're welcome. I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to produce free content. It is our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.